Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting of the DeKalb City Council, October 8, 2018. One item of housekeeping, as we usually do, we would request anyone who would like to speak to any item on the agenda, and for our Committee of the Whole, we only have one item. But also, if you'd like to speak to any item not on the agenda, we'd ask that you kindly fill out a speaker request form and hand it to our City Clerk, Lynn Fazekas, who will be getting that to me and will get you on the agenda. Having said that, I'd ask City Clerk Fazekas to call the roll, please.
Jacobson.
Here.
Finucane.
Here.
Marquardt.
Here.
Fagan.
Here.
Noreko. Here. Verbeek.
Here.
Favor.
Here.
Smith.
Here.
8 present.
There are no items listed here that are on the regular agenda. Is there any public participation? Anyone wanting to speak to this item or any item? If not, we can move right into our primary consideration, and that is our 2018 property tax levy overview. And I'd like to ask our finance director / our interim city manager, Molly Talkington, to speak to this item. Molly.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council. So I'm back in front of you on the property tax overview for 2018. Part of why this is moved forward to your Committee of the Whole meeting versus waiting till your budget workshop later in the month is because the outcome of the direction in which Council has me proceed on the property tax levy does have an impact on what you need to do when we look at the budget balancing measures. And I say that in should Council choose to follow policy that would significantly reduce the budget gap that you need to solve at that workshop, or if you choose to go with the rate, that's a much different impact on there. So I'll go back through really you have like 3 options this time because I've added an option from the Finance Advisory Committee that was obtained at their last meeting just a week ago. So as a reminder, a property tax levy, the foundation it's a dollar amount, it's on a calendar year basis. You have your very first option is the recommended is in the financial policies, and that a tax levy is a stable funding source. So what I was calling throughout the report your base levy is your police pension, which is a $3.1 million actuarial determined amount. Fire pension is $3.5 million. IMRF is $770,000. And debt service, the amount that we levy for is $5.5 million, but City Council has chosen for all city debt to abate that amount. So the only remaining part on that debt service levy is what is related to the library building, and that's $494,000. A corporate levy, this is anything that's remaining that Council would choose to fund for your general fund. So it could go to additional police officer positions or fire, public works. It supports that day-to-day operations found within the general fund. You have your FICA, which is like Social Security, that's about $625,000. Right now that is not funded by the property tax levy, nor is the IMRF funding amount in your current 2017 levy. Then you have, the library operations levy. So the library every year asks for a request of funding to the City Council because it's under your authority that you levy their property tax. What the library board is asking for this year is assuming there's growth in the equalized assessed valuation. So if we assume it's a 4% growth, the request is $2.1 million. And as you recall, they have a rebate that they're going to present as well of the $992,500 from the prior year's tax levies related to the grant funding that was delayed at the state level. And then you have 4 special service areas: Heritage Ridge, Knowles, Creek Row, and Heartland Fields. And those are specific areas within town, so it's not for the entire city. You'll see in the regular council meeting tonight, you have another special service area to consider, and we've done a few. At prior council meetings, those won't be included until the following year, so you won't see them on this property tax levy. So what your financial policies say, the very first item, there's kind of a few steps you can walk through, but 1A is that we levy for police, fire, and IMRF pensions per those actuarial calculations. So if council chose to do the property tax levy at policy, then that would be a $7.8 million levy, because remember the levy is a dollar amount, not the rate. And it would be a 20% increase, or a $1.3 million increase. This, if you're assuming you have a $150,000 home, where the equalized assessed value didn't change on that home, so it's $150 last year, it's $150 this year, that would be a $99 increase compared to their 2017 levy. Now I realize that that's a large increase on the homeowner, and that's probably not the most likely choice for City Council this year. So we do have kind of the next two options, which I'll focus on these two, because I think this is where the council decision will lie between these two options. So your second option is the Finance Advisory Committee option. This was new on this report. We didn't have this in the prior report. And what Finance Advisory Committee said is, the policy says all of this needs to be through property tax levy, but they recognize there are some other revenue sources we receive in the general fund that are property tax in nature. So if the water fund were not part of the city of DeKalb and it was similar, like in Champaign they have the Illinois American Water, right? If they are a separate company, they would be paying us taxes on their property. But our water department is part of the city, so they don't pay property tax on their assets. Should they pay property tax on their assets, it would have been about $321,000. So we're going to credit that towards what would be covered in property tax, because we're going to assume that's very similar to what a property tax would be. So we're not going to ask the homeowners to increase, or property owners to increase their tax levy by that amount, because we got that source from the water department. So we're going to count that against kind of the required amount you have for police, fire, and IMRF. So we credit that pilot. So you'll see it's a negative number here. So we're starting at that $7.8 million, and we're going to work down a little bit. You also receive your tax increment finance surplus funding. Again, that's the tax increment financing funds are where the portion above the base amount, that increment, is a property tax. It stays within that tax increment financing fund. But when we declare a surplus, it goes back to the taxing agencies by their portion of the bill, so we get about the 9%. So that portion for FY19 is estimated at $255,000. So we'll reduce that required need for the tax levy there. And then you have a large contract with the Northern Illinois University. We provide fire and EMS services to Northern Illinois. Again, they are an entity that does not pay property taxes on the assets they own. So I factored 30% of that contract, because when I went and looked at fire's budget in whole, 30% of the fire department budget is that pension payment. So I took 30% of that contract and credited towards this property tax levy. So that reduces it another $250,000. So the levy requirement that you would need for 2018, sorry, would be $7.02 million. So that would be an 8.1% increase over the 2017 levy, and would cover the funding needs that you have for all of those three items, police, fire, and IMRF, because those other sources are an income into the general fund. This, if you're looking at your current budget balancing gap, remember we're at the $1.6, $1.7 million target. This would help reduce that gap about $390,000 in FY19. Now over the 5 years that changes a little bit, because that TIF surplus, TIF 1 goes away, so by the year 5, that $249,000 is actually zero, because you don't have a surplus in the last year of that plan, but it does positively impact by reducing that gap, because you found a funding source instead of budget reductions to help fill that gap. So this could offset a portion of your budget balancing need by $390,000. But it would result in an increase to the home, or the property tax. So the $150,000 home is a $24 increase from 2017. And it would be an increase in the rate of 0.0478. So that's your FAC option on the tax levy. The next one's all based on what your growth is. So our equalized assessed value here in the city, here's the kind of a historical view. We hit a peak in 2007, 2008 and have gone down, but now we're back on the climb. We're rising. Things are improving here in the city. We've also got new development that plays into this growth. So as we've talked about frequently, we have, the new Cornerstone property. That one has not been fully assessed yet, but that'll come on in a future tax year. But it's items like that where it was nothing, and now we've built a building that helps for the new development, or if people have made changes and improvements to their existing structures, all of that helps in the growth that we capture in our equalized assessed value. So the early estimate from the county is that the city of DeKalb will see a 4% growth overall. So that accounts for any reassessments on properties, any changes to what people have done to their property if they've built it out. It actually accounts for declines in other people's property and for new construction. So the 4% from the county is an early estimate because they don't actually give us their final projected EAV until the end of this month. So I don't have that, but they were saying 4%. But the actual equalized assessed valuation doesn't come into, it isn't finalized until next year. So you have this window in April of 2019 where we finalize the tax levy with the county. It's when all of the assessed value is final, and it's final through people have an opportunity to do the Board of Appeals. They can appeal what their property is assessed for, and a lot of different things that happen at that assessor level. So that equalized assessed growth doesn't get finalized until April. So we have the short window of time where the city can say, yes, that's the levy and that's what we wanted. So this next option is targeting keeping the same rate. So right now on your base levy, your rate is 1.22. So we're making really an early estimated, educated guess on what that equalized growth is. But the formula, when we turn in the information to the county, we're giving them a dollar amount. So we need to make some assumptions on what we're going to grow as a city, and then that helps us determine what our rate is. So the rate is actually the outcome of this whole process. So to make sure we stay at the same rate, the 1.22 for these base levies, what I was asking is for financial forecasting and budget, we can take that early estimated county growth of 4% and put that figure in to our budgets. So that figure is $6.5 million. Oh, I'm sorry, $6.8 million. So we'll budget on the lower figure. But I will ask you to adopt your property tax levy assuming 6% equalized assessed value growth. Because by law, City Council can lower their levy after it's been adopted. They cannot increase their levy. So if we adopt the levy at a higher growth, and let's say we're lucky and growth comes in at 5%, we're able then to abate in April once we know the final assessed growth, so that 1.22 is the rate now, 1.22 will be the rate then. But we'll be able to capture all the growth in the city. We'll capture all the 5% of growth instead of just at 4%, which is what we've budgeted. So then at that point in time, if the growth comes in at 5%, we've budgeted for, we've actually added to our revenue. We have a little bit more than we had anticipated budgeting-wise. So that's why I was calling it most likely. Most likely will go into everything we budget, and then we would adopt at the 6% growth in order to make sure we capture all of the growth and we keep the rate the same. The goal of this option is the rate's 1.22, and at the end of 2018, in 2019, when we get the final information, we keep the rate 1.22. So by capturing the growth, if your home is $150,000 home and you haven't done anything to change the amount on your home, there is no increase to your tax bill. So it really comes down to City Council when we talk about the base levy. Do you want to look at trying to capture your policy in a manner that using the Finance Advisory Committee method where you actually credit some other property tax revenue sources against it, and you would see an increase of about $24 to a $150,000 home, or do you want to try to just capture the growth and keep the rate the same? That's your big question when it comes to City Council and base levy. You have your other levies, which I didn't put slides on here. We talked about them briefly. You have the library levy. They're doing that same model for the rate. They want to keep the same rate and capture the growth. So they would go down that same exercise. If you chose that option, they would be doing that same option, but then they will add their abatement for the tax rebate, that $992,500. And that's approximately $90 on a $150,000 home that will be reduced from the library's levy. And then you have your SSAs that I had on the earlier slide. I'll go back to them. And those are for specific areas only within the city. So Heritage Ridge is a $1,000 SSA. Knowles would be $5,501. Greek Row, $16,400. And Heartland Fields, $2,500. And that is all your levies, so I'll entertain any questions that you have.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions, comments. Molly, you really need some direction tonight, right?
Correct.
You need to know whether or not we want to stay completely in our policy, which we did not do last year, and that would be, for lack of a better term, option one. Option two would be to follow the FAC recommendations, which we did not do real well last year, if I recall correctly. And that would then give us about $500,000 relief from some of the projected budget adjustments that you've given us as options. Is that correct? Okay.
Right. 390.
And option three then would be staying with the same rate, which in layman's term is no tax increase for anyone owning a home in the city of DeKalb. I know that's oversimplification, but does that pretty much capture what you've said in financial terms?
Yes, that captures.
Is that something that is understandable here? It's understandable to me, but whether or not it's understandable to everybody here on the dais, I don't know. But with that, I would open up any comments. Yes, Alderman Noriko.
I think you did an excellent job explaining it, but as usual, I have a question. You indicated that with the Finance Advisory Committee option, that we would still be left with needing another $390,000 from other funding sources?
No, so it would reduce that. So we've been talking about your budget balancing gap being $1.6 to $1.7 million. It would reduce that by $390,000.
So we still have $1 million to cut.
Right.
Okay, I guess
when
how do you arrive at the $390,000 figure? Because I'm looking at adding the
you're not going to see it on the report. I went and put it back into the financial forecast model. So I redid the model.
Oh,
so I knew the dollar amount,
okay.
But it's not.
So it's not in here?
It's not in your paper.
Oh,
no.
okay, okay. Thanks. I'm searching, trying to add things and
No, but what I
subtract.
will do, depending on which option you pick, that forecast I can update, which I've done, and I'll have the new forecast for you with whichever property tax levy you decided, which option you want to
Okay.
do. So you'll see that at the budget workshop that's coming up this month.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional comments? Alderman Fagan.
Help me out here. That last, we had two choices from the finance. You had one with 0 increase on property tax to the homeowner. Which one? You want to put that back up there?
The one that's the 0 property tax is this one, keeping the rate the same.
Keeping the rate the same and reaping the benefit from the AV.
Correct.
And that's what we did last year.
That's what you did last year, but last year we didn't do the most likely optimistic. So I'm adding a little bit more of a, I'd say a complication to explaining it, but I want to make sure that we capture the full growth because the equalized assessed value is an estimate when we're working right now. So I want to make sure that if you're trying to keep the rate the same, that we're able to capture the full rate, and the property tax law doesn't let you increase at any point.
Right.
So if we levy at 4% and it comes in at 5%, you lose that
We lose that
1%
one.
and your rate goes down.
And that's something that Alderman Marquardt was getting at, on why we have this discussion in the first place, and where we want to be. And then I believe that's where we're at. And maybe you can help me out with a little history on this, because, I mean, this is a question I asked myself before I was elected, and people continue to ask me this. You know, back in 2008, we had a pretty good rate going for us throughout the community. And then when the housing values went down, which is the EAV, it went down, and so we increased rate.
Right, because remember, the rate is a byproduct of what dollar amount you've turned in for your levy
Right.
with the equalized assessed value. So if that significantly swings up or down, your rate changes.
All right, so now we've seen this go up. I'm looking at it right now. I mean, we're up close to 100 million, am I right? From where it was before, give or take?
From 2015.
Give or take, you know, amongst friends, a couple million. So then, has the rate come down?
It came down last year. That should be in the report, because the equalized assessed value was the opposite. I had estimated 5.2% increase. It came at 5.1. So the 2016 rate overall, so it would be the base rate plus all the SSAs together. We had a little different last year. I tried to separate it out a little bit more this year. So it was 1.6629 in 2016 for all of those. And then it was 1.6187 because the EAV went down. The growth was 5.1%, not 5.2%. So when we
Okay.
tried to target that rate,
Right.
we missed on the
And I mean,
estimation.
I'm asking these questions to not only educate myself, but educate people that are watching and doing this. So, okay, well, thank you very much.
If we stay at that same rate as option number 3, as Alderman Fagan was alluding to in his questioning, would it be safe to assume then that if we were to exercise that option, same as last year, that would have no discernible impact on the projected $1.6 million deficit?
No, it's a smaller impact. It's not, I think it's less than $100,000 difference from what I put in the forecast, because I was keeping that
Okay.
amount out. But either way you choose, I will update your gap that you have to kind of fill for your budget workshop. So either option will help you. The significance of how much it helps solve that budget gap is the difference between the rate, which will be less than $100,000 benefit to that, solving the gap, and then the FAC option is about $400,000.
Believe me, I hear no more taxes, no more taxes. I hear that, okay? I also am looking at that $1.6 million deficit. And since we talked about that 2 weeks ago, I've had more folks around the community say, well, we can't cut here, we can't cut there, but we need to address that deficit. You know, and I know the only one of the alternatives, as unattracted as it is to this city council, is to utilize some of our fund balance. But we've had a situation where I think this council did not want to do that. So that's a comment. I'm going to turn it over to Alderman Jacobson.
Again, this is it's frustrating to go through this every year, and it's understandable. The reason we have to have this discussion every year and this question is because we're acting outside of our existing policy. Our policy is certainly the best practice. The hope is that you would use your entire levy that would be equal to your responsibilities and pensions. And I think that, I don't think anyone would disagree that would be a best practice and something that we aspire to without a doubt. The reality is it's effectively impossible without a massive tax increase that I think would be very difficult to sell to the community. Again, the property taxes as we use them in the city aren't going to fund directly our public service entities. They're not going to directly fund our police and fire or our base services. They're going to retiree obligations in our community. And I think that's one of the biggest frustrations of the residents that I talk to is no more taxes to support people that are retired. And again, I realize there's two sides of that argument, absolutely, and that we've made promises, and those promises are constitutionally protected by the Illinois state government, whether I choose to agree with that idea or not. The reality is that's what we're using these dollars for and coming in. And to answer Alderman Fagan's question, no, the reality is even going back to 08, they have never gone down. I think that was one of the biggest frustrations coming out of the council that I heard from residents is, hey, my house is worth 20 or 30% less than it was a few years ago, and my taxes are actually going up. How is that even possible? And our answer was, those obligations are those obligations, and we have to fund them whether your house is worth $1 million or $50. One way or the other, we have to pull the revenue out of them. Again, going back to the idea that the reason we have to have this discussion every year is that we are acting outside of fund balance policy or funding policy. I think it's incumbent upon us, and I think this is the perfect juncture to talk about what we can do in at least the near term to address that reality that we're not in a position that we could go up to that funding balance policy, being cognizant that no, we shouldn't pull it off the books because it is something that hopefully eventually the growth will catch up to and should be the best practice that we're following. I can only imagine for staff going through annually this discussion what the frustration is, again, knowing that we are violating our own internal policy, number one on that list. If that's the case, what can we do in the interim to make sure that we are acting under some guise of a policy? It's clear we can't meet number one. It just isn't feasible in the environment we're in right now. So then what do we do, again, for a 5 or 10 year range out to say this is the policy we'll follow in the interim? Again, being cognizant that any council could come back and procedurally change that reality, but that it would require that procedural change to come in front of council as a hurdle, as an impediment to whatever policy we put on the books. And I know we talked about it last year when we were at the same situation. We'd like to cap the amount of taxes on the existing homeowners while still continuing to capture the additional growth that we desperately need, of course. So then, obviously, again, now for the probably 4th or 5th time since I've been up here, the discussion is how do we capture that growth? Understanding what's being presented to us now between the 4 and 6% spread, understanding again that there is some difficulty in ascertaining what that exact number will be until the county releases those numbers much later in the process before taxes are due. It allows for that spread to be a possibility. Again, the cynic in me, which I'm sure you're all very well used to at this point, says when we get down to budget time at that 11th hour that we've gotten to many times since I've been up here, is that going to be, whether it's this staff or a future staff or this council or a future council, is someone going to say, well, we levied for the full 6% and that's already the number on the books, so let's just go to that whole 6%, which again would result in a tax increase and would be the easiest and path of least resistance in terms of passing a budget at the 11th hour. And we've seen that. And I know, again, prior to this council that's seated here, one of the years we capped it at that rate, exactly what the dollars were the year before, because the fear was at the last minute that any increase into the unknown would be used inappropriately to go to the maximum increase. Again, I would feel comfortable by policy then setting the direction of the council as saying, we're going to freeze taxes at this rate for 5 years. We're going to make sure that before the levy comes back, it will be equal to whatever that EAV growth is. So that there isn't a question, hey, we levied for 6 and we're only going to capture 4. The policy that we will put on the books, again, in the short-term horizon, will be that we will add, or we will equal that number to whatever that EAV growth is, And in reality, we'll be following that policy, both through number 2 this year and beyond, with the reality that that will cap the taxes until the community starts to grow, whether internally or externally. When your value starts going up, your taxes will continue to go up. That's how inflation, that's how the market works. When you can get more for your house, you should be paying your fair share back in to cover the services that are required in this community. But I think it sends the message out to the taxpayers that until that happens, until if your house stays the same value or goes down, we won't raise your taxes. And put that on the books for a 5 or 10 year horizon, and then we don't have to have this argument every year. It sets clear direction to the finance director. It sets clear direction to staff exactly what we're going to do. And if we use the 4 to 6% spread or that 2% spread in our budgeting, which I think is a responsible way of doing it, so we don't miss out on that actual growth, understanding that, again, that spread will be there, but it's not to be used unless the actual growth is there. So that's how I'd feel comfortable doing it. I would certainly support that way of doing it again this year, and I think that now is the time and the appropriate place to bring up a policy change, again, on a short-term horizon, not to remove the policy of number 1, but to effectively draft a policy at this point going into this budget process that caps taxes and allows for that growth to be captured each year.
Thank you, David. Alderman Noriko.
I would like to hear some discussion about the Finance Advisory Committee suggestion or recommendation. There's been a lot of discussion about utilizing that committee. They've come forward with a suggestion, and I'd be interested in hearing how conventional their recommendation is. Are they really, kind of at the outer edges of what's reasonable with this suggestion? How the other council members feel about that?
So I would say that this is not a typical option that I've seen, usually for best practices. However, the items they chose to select as offsetting or the crediting ones truly do represent what could be a property tax. So they're in that similar vein, like the water pilot, because that's a payment in lieu of taxes. That's a very consistent number for us, so it is fairly stable. By putting it into your reports and having you adopt a levy under that way, I think could help strengthen some of our arguments with Moody's if we come to another bond rating saying, we recognize you want us to have a stable revenue source, such as the property tax levy, but we consider something like the water pilot stable. And you would have it outlined so they could read it and digest it, but I don't think that's something that, if I went to Moody's on their own, that they would have said, oh, use the water pilot. So it's a little off of the mainstream in that fashion. However, all of the things that they wanted credited are tax levy in nature. So they do, I think, work in the sense of what you're trying to do with your policy. So it fits in that vein of what the policy is trying to capture.
So, as the finance budget director, you're comfortable with that as an option?
Oh, yes, I am.
Okay.
I would say the one thing I did tell FAC is that this is essentially accounting for something in a different manner. You don't solve the budget gap with those offsets. That's just saying those things are credited towards your property tax levy, so you're limiting the ability to increase your tax levy to a higher amount, like the very first one to policy under the traditional manner. But it's definitely something that can be considered, and I think it's good for you to consider as an option.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Verbeek.
I'll be one more mayor, no more taxes. And that's what I continue to hear echoed across the community is that if we do consider a tax increase, then how do we justify that? What are those dollars going toward to the benefit of the city today and into the future? I echo your sentiment on the work of the FAC, a great idea. I'm torn, though, because I'm not one that would generally support property taxes as a method to help balance our budget, per se. But what I do like the sound of is being able to plan on a fixed rate. May it be fixed, may it be graduated. To echo Alderman Jacobson's point, I believe that the growth is optimistic. It would be appropriately captured, yet we would also be responsive to a majority of the people that continue to ask to relieve their tax burden.
Alderman Markwart.
The couple of questions about the different sources here. The water pilot, is that real money?
Yes, right. So it's captured in the water fund. So the water fund is supported like a business through your charges to your water bill. And so there's the nexus of that revenue source. So the revenue source is what we charge you for water and sewer, right? And that goes into that fund. And then we have an actual kind of formula calculation based on the assets of that fund that we then determine the property tax portion that comes back to the general fund.
So that, in the past, that has come into the general fund and help support general fund activities.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So in the current year, because remember you moved about $450,000 of police and fire pensions to other general fund sources, you could credit that 320 to that part already in the current year.
Okay. And the fire and EMS services contract with NIU.
So that one gets a little bit more complicated in how, because it's not a one-for-one, right? The water pilot is, a payment in lieu of taxes, and that's exactly what it's doing. It's calculating what you would have paid in taxes.
Right.
The fire and EMS service fund is a little bit more difficult to do that because it pays for everything we provide for fire and EMS services to NIU. So it's not just the pension funding portion.
Right.
So when I looked at the fire department's budget, we charge NIU for charge for service, or calls per service. And we use the fire department's budget entirety as part of the kind of funding formula. So when I look at the fire department's budget in total, 30% of their budget in total is pension costs. So I took 30% of that contract and counted that towards pension costs. That's how you get to the 249.
Right. But that would be taking away from funds that would be used to actually support the operations once again, right?
Correct. So right now it's in the general fund going to everything else in your general fund.
All right. So that's real out. And the TIF surplus part there, is that the
So it's funding we've already, what?
Is that the sales tax part? Is
No.
that just the,
This
how'd you
is
come up with that?
It's the surplus dollar amount on the property tax portion of the surplus. So we have an intergovernmental agreement with the taxing agencies that 50% of all property taxes that come in, or of the taxes that come in, get distributed out to the taxing bodies each year. So this is your 50% IGA calculation.
And that's where the actual savings, as far as looking at a budget, is really just the 390 and not 750,000 or whatever.
Right, because these were already in kind of the formula.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And the TIF surplus one, that agreement's only through the life of TIF 1. So each year it's around the 250,000 that is now, but by the 5th year of your forecast it's 0 because that TIF ends. So it can only be counted for a short period of time. Now if you go ahead and have TIF 3, and there is a potential, if you choose to decide to do surplus out of TIF 3, then we could pick it up from there. But right now you haven't decided on TIF 3 or if there'll be a surplus, so I haven't accounted for that.
Alderman Fanouken.
Molly, as I sit here trying to absorb all this, a question comes to my mind. What if we could work on a hybrid of 2 and 3? where we had the pilot with the water fund along with the trying to capture that 4% growth, how could we make something like that work to even make it better? I guess that's my question is, would something like that be feasible?
That would be difficult because you're calculating it in two different ways. I'd have to think about it. I'm not entirely sure I could do a combination of both because the rate's trying to, or the growth one is trying to keep the same rate.
Right.
But if you're going to offset with the water pilot, then you're actually reducing the rate.
Okay.
And that would actually make your budget gap worse.
All right. Well, that's why I'm asking the question. All right. Thank you.
Any other comments? So the way I see this here is that we can go with what I would call the option 2, which is the following the FAC recommendations would result in a slight increase in taxes for the taxpayers in the city of DeKalb. We can stay with what we've done this past year, utilizing the same rate, which would then be no more taxes for citizens owning a home in the city of DeKalb. Are there any other options? Alderman Verbeek.
No, just to say, if you're looking for direction, then I would support option 3, freezing the rate, and the optimistic level of 6% to be able to capture that potential growth, and would again continue to echo Alderman Jacobson's point to use that same rate for future forecasting for the next 5 years, several years, whatever. We'll call it the recovery policy.
Alderman Fanouken.
I think I'd also agree with option 3 with just trying to capture the additional growth. And again, using the 6% perceived estimated assessed value. I think that's the one way we can assure that unless someone's home or property has been assessed to a higher value, that they would have no tax increase.
So I hear agreement on from Alderman Jacobson, Alderman Fanouken, and Alderman Verbeek. Alderman Fagan, do you feel fairly comfortable with that, Alderman Favor? I think we have consensus.
Okay, so I will.
What? Okay. Okay. Consensus means to me more than
Well,
half,
that's,
but yes,
you
but
know, and, you know, I'm comfortable with that. The piece of it I'm uncomfortable with is tying ourselves for 5 years to that kind of quote-unquote policy. You know, it doesn't seem to account for, you know, any potential emergency situations. And I realize in some ways we're in an emergency situation. So I will, you know, in the interest of, you know, consensus and moving forward and doing what is reasonable, go along with it. But I just have that qualm, concern issue.
Alderman Fagan.
I believe Alderman Jacobson alluded to it, that, yes, I mean, we can put it in policy for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Can somebody break that policy? Yeah, they
We're doing
can.
now.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
right. I mean, yeah, it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think the 5-year window that Alderman Jacobson, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, is a cast in stone kind of
It
scenario.
merely forces a pause to make a cognizant choice to change, to override
Okay.
that financial policy that
Right.
we've agreed on.
Okay. You aren't
Yeah.
going to die on that issue or anything? Okay.
Alderman Markwart.
So essentially, if we follow that policy, taking into account that we can use the pilot to make up the $1 million in thing, that still gives us $760,000 to figure out for pension costs.
Right, you're still at $1.6 million in total for your budget gap, but yes, a part of it will be that $700,000 remaining from other general fund
Just
sources.
talking about pension part is 760 or thereabout.
Right.
Okay. Well, at least I guess we know that part. So in figuring that 1.6, was that predicated on which one of these?
It was based on the policy you enacted in 2017, which is a little different than, you did keep the same rate, but that shifted about $450,000 to other general fund sources. So if I target the rate again, it actually moves a little bit of that 450 back to the tax levy. So I will redo the forecast and show it to you guys at the budget workshop to show the impact. And in that 5 years, I'll make kind of assumptions on what the growth will be for the 5 years, so you can see if you kept the same rate, how that impacted overall.
Yeah, my sense too, Mike, is that option 2 was our finance director's attempt to address and soften some of the $1.6 million deficit that we may, in subsequent budget workshops here, face. Is that a correct
Yes,
statement?
so that was the Finance Advisory Committee's
Right,
attempt
right,
to do
precisely,
that.
yeah, right. Alderman Jacobson.
Just because I have some confusion on it, we're already collecting a pilot from the water fund. It's just going directly into general fund now. The Finance Advisory Committee's recommendation is to effectively assign that to pension liabilities, correct?
Correct, so that's why I said in your current year, because you've already shifted police, $450,000 in police and fire, you could credit that water pilot to that amount that wasn't covered by the levy. So you've essentially done it this year. We just haven't formalized it on a,
Correct. I
you
mean,
know,
we're
a report to show
effectively
you.
using that pilot now. It's
Right.
out one end in the other. Effectively, it's where what's assigning it to the pension obligation, I think. And again, that doesn't change the numbers. It merely just shifts them around and how they're accounted for.
Correct, it's an
in the
accounting
budget.
shift.
And we could still do that regardless of how we freeze or what we do with the levy. We would be assigning that those revenues off the top would then be earmarked for pensions. And then we'd have to find a way to pay for the other things they're paying for.
Right,
But
right,
we have to pay for the
precisely.
pensions anyway, so it's all the same thing. It's how you account for them as line items.
Yeah.
It helps me put numbers in perspective.
And I don't have a problem with, again, I would support that. If
Yeah.
that was the direction of the council, I would support that. Earmark for your responsibilities first and know what you have left over at the end to spend on your operations and set your operations to that target.
And since that one is so specifically property tax, I think in the long run it actually would help with our bond rating at the same time, because you can make a really good argument to Moody's for that. The other ones get a little more wishy-washy, but tying that in there, and at least that way too, forecasting going out, you can have a good estimate of what that dollar amount would be, somewhat, and would allow you to do that, since you don't, you know, the TIF surplus and these other things are all fluctuating all over the place. That gives you at least a good forecasting tool.
Unless there's further comment, I think what we've done is we provided you the direction you needed. I think some of the peripheral points, if you will, that have come up tonight is fodder for further discussion in our budget workshops, and our next budget workshop is when? Next week? Well, I don't know.
Of course, you asked me and I forgot it.
It's Tuesday next week.
Thank you.
What was that? The day?
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Tuesday of next week? Okay, very good. Any further discussion on the committee of the whole meeting? If not, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Alderman Alderman Verbic, seconded by Alderman Fagan, that we adjourn this committee of the whole. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? We are adjourned. City Council begins promptly at 6 o'clock. Thank you.